The city was pure gold, like unto clear glass. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third chalcedony, the fourth an emerald. The 12 gates were 12 pearls. The street of the city was pure gold.
Two delicious ripe fruit flavors growing on the stick.
This city now doth like a garment wear, the beauty of the morning silent bear.
What is the physical face of modern industrial society? The question arose in ghoulish fashion in World War II. What should the Allied bombers destroy? An historic dispute developed. The American desk warriors held the vital things were factories, refineries, railroad yards. The British planners argued for the city. This was the industrial society. Destroy the city, and you destroyed all. The difference was not based on compassion or on any deep philosophical insight. Proceeding at night, the RAF bombers could find only cities, and going by day, the United States Army Air Forces could see, although they couldn't reliably hit, factories. So military convenience was, as often, the parent of thought. But there's much to be said for the British view. The factory is only one part of the physical paraphernalia of the industrial civilization, and the city is nearly all. It is the mirror of social achievement and of misfortune, too. Poverty is a case in point. Poverty, in by far its most common form, we now know, is a problem of land and people. And for such poverty, the city is the escape hatch. So it has been for centuries. People are forced off the land by deprivation, and they're drawn to the cities by the chance for wages, or if not wages, then better social services, more compassionate standards of welfare. It is not that the city is good, but that the alternatives are always worse. There were other reasons, of course. Some of us were always refugees from that hard work on a farm. The city, then, is the focus of the problems of the modern society. Its uncertainty, its crises, hope, despair, all are there. To understand the modern city is to understand the social ills that most oppress us. Understanding begins with the realization that there isn't one kind of city, but several. The modern metropolis is a combination of all the different kinds of cities that have gone before. Classification is the first step in science, but it seems to me that it has lagged where the urban culture is concerned. There are 5 distinct types of cities. Some had their greatest glory in the past, but all have a modern counterpart. Names are necessary. Of cities, there are the royal household, or possibly we might call it the political household, the merchant city, the industrial city, the great camp, sometimes called the suburb, and now the polyglot metropolis. To understand the modern metropolis, we must see the cities that went before. The most potent still of the ancestral images is the City of the Princes. As an expression of one man's taste and personality, as a manifestation of the grandeur of his realm, this is still without equal.
All persons draw near and give note to the sovereign command of the Shahin Shah. The superintendents of affairs shall erect here proud and lofty buildings. Upon this hill of Sikri, his masons shall set a great city, whose name shall be Fatehpur, which is victory.
Fatehpur Sikri in India has been called the world's most perfectly preserved ghost town. It was built by Akbar the Great on a low rocky ridge 24 miles from Agra. The site was chosen, it is said, because there in the village of Sikri lived a holy man whom Akbar had visited when he was in despair over the prospect for a son and heir. As a result of the visit, a son, Jahangir, was forthcoming. And in gratitude, around 1571, Akbar quarried the beautiful salmon-red stone of the ridge, made a lake some 20 miles around, and built a new capital. It was larger than London, and its public buildings by a wide margin more elegant. It is still there. That this city was the extension of one personality is not in doubt. At Fatehpur Sikri, we see in the clearest possible form the city that I have called the royal or political household. Over the centuries, nothing has been so used to enhance royal personality, armed slaughter apart, as the architectural embellishment of the seat of government. And Fatehpur Sikri is our purest case. The royal household is mostly of the past, but it remains powerfully in our minds as the basic image of what a city should be like. And it has also a modern prototype. The idea lends itself well to modern political rhetoric. The greatness of the capital measures the greatness of the state. President Kubitschek of Brazil.
From this central plateau, from which will emanate decisions of vital national importance, I look once more to the future of my country and foresee this dawn with unshakable belief in the greatness of our destiny.
From the royal household came the notion that government has a special claim to architectural magnificence and civic grandeur, as here with Brasilia. Industrialists are expected to work, although not to live, in cities of considerable squalor. Their office buildings may be tall, but they must be functional. Politicians, even bureaucrats, should have more refined surroundings. Their cities should be planned, their buildings embellished, however crudely, as was the royal household. What rejoices the eye must be nicely balanced with what might distress the taxpayer. From this calculation have come the modern capitals, Washington, New Delhi, Canberra, Islamabad, Brasilia, cities that, like Fatehpur Sikri, have been built in accordance with a ruling conception and design. Their order and symmetry have a strong claim on the eye. It's worth a thought that these are almost the only modern cities that the modern tourist ever wants to visit.
On the right of the bridge here, the Beguinage. Inside, a nunnery and little houses where the lace makers living. À droite du pont, ici devant, l'entrée du béguinage. Oppassen voor het hoofd, alstublieft. Attention la tête, s'il vous plaît. Mark your head, please.
The merchant city, the second of our 5 cities, also had a strong unity of design. This was less the result of central authority than of a unity of taste. Merchants must be sensitive to fashion, and at any time in architecture as in dress, there is a ruling style. This merchant city is Bruges in Belgium. Bruges was a member of the Hanseatic League, and once it was the northern counterpart of Venice itself, the Venice of the North. It was saved from the modern world when its access to the sea silted up in the 15th century, and when fate put it a mere 20 miles behind the guns in World War I. The strong sense of collective interest of the merchants was manifested in both the design of the houses and the plan of the town. Within this larger framework, there was then a rewarding competition. The quality and style of the house advertised the quality and style of the merchandise available therefrom. So Bruges, like the other merchant cities, Venice, Florence, Genoa, Bremen, Lubeck, such of them as survived the wars, had much of the order and elegance of the royal household. And this the guides do not fail to tell.
Voorbij de volgende brug aan de rechter. On your right, the Pelican House. Verticale 1634. Die merken boven de ingangsdeur.
They aren't the first. In 1438, a visiting merchant gave his impression of Bruges. Note well the admiring tone.
The products of the whole world are brought here so that they have everything in abundance in exchange for the work of their hands. The people of this part of the country are exceedingly cleanly in their apparel, but very extravagant. Without doubt, the great goddess of luxury has great power here, but it is not a place for poor men who would be badly received. But anyone who has money and wishes to spend it will find in this town alone everything which the whole world produces. I saw there oranges and lemons from Castile, fruits and wines from Greece, confections and spices from Alexandria, furs from the Black Sea.
Elegance and excellence must be celebrated. A poor place has few parades. The Guild Hall, Town Hall, and Cathedral each had function in the merchant city. They proclaimed, regulated, and sanctified the gains from trade. The houses and palaces of the merchants were places of business, places of residence, and a sure source of community esteem. So they were the subject of much thought. In the merchant city, men were valued less for what they were than for where they lived. A nice, straightforward, objective test of merit for which many people must still yearn. With the Industrial Revolution, civic pride withered. The very connotation of the word city changed. Before 1776, it had an overtone of grandeur. The phrase heavenly city seemed not to be a contradiction in terms. Had the Bible been written after the Industrial Revolution, paradise would not have been a city. whatever the paving of the streets. Slowly but certainly, a reference to a city became a reference to something not grand, but sordid. There was much about the industrial city, to which we now come, which assured this reputation. The people of its factories were a utility, a servo mechanism. They were important only for their effort, and this was not diminished by their being shabby, unwashed, rough of manner, or ripe of smell. These attributes minimized personal expenditure, living costs. And in the industrial city, men sought not elegance, but low cost. Nor was this entirely to be deplored. The industrial city, unlike its predecessors, produced goods in quantity for those who were also poor. The people of the industrial city were not very beautiful, nor was their housing, nor a commonplace point were the processes by which goods were made. On the contrary, these almost invariably involved smoke and grime, for coal had to be dug and washed, ore had to be smelted, locomotives had to be fired, steam engines had to be fueled. And all of these operations spread filth. In considering the effect of economic growth on our surroundings, on the environment, we might remember that industrial progress has been a remarkably steady march from foul processes to clean, from dirty coal to clean gas, from dirty foundries to clean control rooms, from the belching steam engine to the wholly antiseptic electric motor. We now have pollution, not because industrial processes are dirtier, but because we produce and consume so much more. But early industrial processes were dirty, and the industrial city was rightly thought to be a squalid place. Finally, among the things affecting the character of the industrial city were the industrialists. The merchant had to be like his customers, a man of some style and taste. Users of coal and steel and chemicals and machinery were not concerned with style, only with cost and performance. And the early consumer products of the industrial city, cloth and more cloth and cheap tin trays, were not stylish either. So the early manufacturer was like his products, solid, efficient, without grace. He built his house above the mills, and it too was solid and often ugly. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Here is the view of Dr. Andrew Ure. He was a chemist and scientific writer of the last century, and as would now be said, an articulate defender of the system.
Factories are magnificent edifices, surpassing far in number, value, usefulness, and ingenuity of construction the boasted monuments of Asiatic, Egyptian, and Roman despotism. In these spacious halls, the benignant power of steam summons around him his myriads of willing menials. Yet, even at the present day, when the system is perfectly organized and its labor lightened to the utmost, it is found nearly impossible to convert persons past the age of puberty into useful factory hands. After struggling for a while to conquer their listless or restive habits, they either renounce the employment spontaneously or are dismissed by the overlookers on account of inattention. They are readily moved to outrage by crafty demagogues, and they are apt to regard their best benefactor, the enterprising and frugal capitalist who employs them, with a jealous eye.
One who would qualify for yours denunciation was Frederick Engels, whom we've met as Karl Marx's great collaborator. In 1845, gathering material for The Condition of the Working Class in England, Engels described Manchester.
And as for the dirt, everywhere one sees heaps of refuse, garbage, and filth. There are stagnant pools instead of gutters, and the stench alone is so overpowering that no human being, even partially civilized, would find it bearable to live in such a district. There is to be found under the railway bridge a court which is even filthier and more revolting than the others. In a hole barely 6 feet long and 5 feet wide, I saw 2 beds, and what beds and what bedding, which filled the room.
When all comes to all, what really matters to the Englishman is his own interest, and above all, his desire to make money. One day I walked with one of these middle-class gentlemen into Manchester. I spoke to him about the disgraceful, unhealthy slums and drew his attention to the disgusting condition in which the factory workers lived. I declared I had never seen so badly built a town in my life. He listened patiently, and at the corner of the street at which we parted company, he remarked,
And yet a great deal of money is made here. Good morning, sir.
In the industrial city, the industrialist was free from restraint. He could do as he needed with air, streams, landscape, and he did. It was a place to shelter the work stock at the lowest possible cost. Given that the purpose of the city was to produce goods cheap, not much more was to be asked. In one variant of the industrial city, the industrialist did take responsibility for inception, design, and administration. He laid out streets, built and owned the houses, built and operated the company store. And he laid on water supply and sewage, if any. This, like the cities of the princes, was an imposed order, an industrial household. Its purpose, however, was to keep down costs and ensure that the inmates of Sullen would not be mutinous. I'm speaking here of the company town. Few creations of man have been so reviled, hated. It's a warning against order without consent. There were exceptions. In the 1840s, Brunel's Great Western Railway built a housing estate for the workers at its new locomotive works at Swindon. The company believed that everything possible should be done to ensure a healthy, intelligent, and non-mutinous workforce. It was a housing estate where people lived in comparative comfort with a decent amount of space. There was consent. The houses were small, but each had a garden, 2 bedrooms, and a toilet. The average at the time was 1 lavatory to every 4 houses. There was a Mechanics' Institute for Education and a Wesleyan Chapel for Spiritual Development. And the cost of Swindon was not very high. But it was only possible for a sizable enterprise like a railway, and a very enlightened one. For both of these reasons, Swindon was the exception, and it had to be. The ruling doctrine of the age was laissez-faire, free enterprise, and this the industrial city was bound to reflect. One could not expect the city to be an island of intelligent order in a non-planned world. Sheffield, Rochdale, Essen, Pittsburgh, Gary are the industrial city in its purest form. But the image is now blurred. Time, change, and economics have melded the industrial city into the final form, the great modern metropolis. New York is the ultimate city, the polyglot metropolis. There's a political household here, the United Nations, also a merchant city, also industry, and around it is our fourth city, the camp. From the earliest days of the industrial city, those who could afford it sought to escape its smoke and its grime, and even more, its unlovely landscape. But the suburban camp owes much to developments since, to the appearance in the economy of a new, well-paid managerial and professional elite. In the camp, the rich and the merely affluent live in comparatively clear air with their private trees and grass. And they have schools, churches, recreation, all of superior quality, the quality ensured and the cost kept down by their not having to be shared with the poor. Unlike the other cities, the camp has no political or economic function. It doesn't rule, sell, or make. It's a place where people find space, and thus its name.
I think one can achieve a certain state of serenity here. It's very nice to be able to come away from the city, come away from the dirty air, the crowds of people, the noise, and to come into the cleaner air, the quieter environment, the lovely, lovely lush trees, and a place where our children can grow up. I find, however, for me, that the hardest part is the lack of mental work and mental stimulation. I need something for my head. For instance, the winters can be very lonely here. You can feel very, very isolated. Unless you're involved in a lot of things that take you outside, you can feel very, very secluded in your house. I think women are very, very private, and we're all stuck away from each other in our houses. At times I feel that it's no place for me to be. But then I think this is the ambivalence of life. One minute, oh, this is just terrific. The next minute, you want to be back where you were. You want to be back in the city. Well, when I lived in the city, there was a lot of violence in the area. When I began to walk around with a baby in a stroller or in a carriage, I quickly began to feel uncomfortable carrying a purse or a handbag. I felt I'd be better off not having it. Just put my money in my pocket. I carried as little cash as I possibly could. So this was a necessary way of life. I don't think like that out here. For me right now, this happens to be the place I'm at, and I think I'm trying to make the best of it. It's lovely to be able to just go out and plunge in my own swimming pool. It's lovely to be able to have 20 people on a weekend. And I'm trying to be happy here, just as one tries everywhere.
The suburbs are good for the children. A child needs clean air and a yard and a barbecue pit and a gas light. We certainly tried very hard to buy a home next to a Negro or other race, color, or creed. God knows we adore integration. But everyone knows children need the feeling of roots that a rec room in a genuine oak-paneled den can offer to split-level households in places called Bonnie Bray Glen, with 4 walk-in closets to walk in, 3 bushes, 2 shrubs, and 1 tree. The suburbs are good for the children, but no place for grown-ups to be.
Sir, Dr. Johnson said, when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. I've always felt exactly that way about New York. In fact, I used to feel that a week when I didn't go there was a week wasted. In the great polyglot metropolis, all of the earlier cities come together. What is it that most distinguishes this metropolis from the industrial city? I should say it was money. Money, rising real income, is a far greater force for change than we commonly imagine. The industrial city had two classes, the capitalist and the proletariat. In the modern metropolis, there is a vast new merchant, professional, technical, governmental, and artistic community, all of which is called into being by the increase in income. This has altered the face of the modern city, for its needs have to be met, and it also introduces new tensions that are different from those of the industrial city, but not in any way less real. These we now see, and as always, we see them most vividly here in New York, where life is always a trifle larger than life itself. As the affluent move to the camps, the poor take their place. And the very poor then replace the merely poor. All see the well-to-do go. Not so many notice that it is a prime function of the modern metropolis to rescue the truly deprived from the world around.
Radio X, La Grande Nueva York presenta...
In New York, the menial jobs are done by the refugees from something worse. And so it is in every world metropolis. Only the names, migrant workers, foreign workers, guest workers, are different. Bad as are the New York slums, there can be hope. In the barrios of Puerto Rico, not even that. A letter home tells the difference.
También.
Mándeme a decir.
My beloved mother, hoping for you that when you receive this letter, you feel the best of your health. As for me, I'm going to tell you what is happening to me when I get to New York. I have to tell you that I got lost for 3 days in a subway train, and that somebody helped me to get back to where I was supposed to be. Well, for the rest, I'm all right. I've just found a job, and I'm planning to stay working so I can bring my brothers over. You know, everybody is saying New York is a big town and there was good jobs and a lot of money here. But in the places I go, everybody speaks Spanish, so that makes it difficult for me to learn.
We saw earlier the oldest remedy for poverty, one of the few within the power of the individual to employ in his own behalf, is to move from the poor country to the rich. It's a hard solution for both. The affluent should not feel, as they sometimes do, that theirs is the only suffering.
I don't like the apartment because there is no landlord, no services, and the ceiling is peeling and the water coming down. Sometimes my old lady, she's very disturbed with her nerves. And also the asthma take her real bad. But I don't know if it is the condition of the apartment or not. I feel bad because she's sick. And I would like to have better things, but there is more opportunity for a job here, and I wouldn't like to go back the same way I came. But Ma, I'm going to tell you that over here is real cold. Not like home. But I'll get used to it. Regards to my brothers and all the family. Your son, Juan.
In the metropolis, the classic conflict between employer and worker recedes. Instead, there are now two working classes. The old, established, relatively well-paid workforce feels threatened, both socially and economically, by the new arrivals. They seem a threat to the standards the old workforce tried so hard to establish and to raise. This is the new tension.
There are those that black, green, purple, orange, or whatever the color may be, those that live like pigs will always remain pigs. And people who want a clean area and clean homes and better schools and better housing for their children and themselves will keep it clean. But when you get a percentage of people that move into an area and 80% of them are pigs in plain English, let's put it that way, and the rest are decent, it's pretty rough. You see, East New York, the particular area where I lived in, you had a mother-father type business, garment type, where they manufactured or they contracted out women's dresses, skirts, and all that. And most of it was Italians that used to work in the factories. When they moved out, you know, little by little, the Spanish and the black people came into it. And out of the clear blue sky, it just deteriorated. Now here it is, we're going through part of it. You look around, you see homes, houses boarded up, and they just let it go. That's where I used to live. I can't believe that in a span of 20 years, this could ever happen to where I live. Let's say I took it personally, you know, as a personal insult. I can't give any more explanation except that people who live there now just don't care one way or the other what happens. They want to live in filth and slime and garbage.
The polyglot metropolis, the great metropolis, is the focus of all of the great migrations of our time. And this migration must be kept in perspective. It is something with which we now have a very considerable historical experience. Migrants coming in numbers, whether they have been Irish, Italians, Jews, have always had an unsettling effect on the people who were already there. Their manners have always seemed a bit crude. They've often been thought lawless. Their personal hygiene has sometimes seemed questionable. And it has always been imagined that the tensions that they introduced were permanent. Then very soon, as in the case of the Irish in Boston or the Jews and Italians in New York, the manners changed, the tensions eased, and presently the newcomers were the new ruling class. In recent times, British cities have had their great influx of Indians and Pakistanis and West Indians. Berlin has become one of the largest Turkish cities in the world. Paris is extensively Algerian. And to the big American cities have come the blacks and the Puerto Ricans. The old suspicions and the old tensions and the old fears have everywhere been recreated. And again, it is imagined that they are permanent. There's not the slightest reason to think that the ultimate resolution will be any different or that it will take any longer than in the case of the previous migrations. In looking at the modern polyglot metropolis, it is very important to know what the real problems are. And it is also important to know what the real problems are not. Meanwhile, of course, the tension. Its everyday manifestation is crime, senseless violence, muggings, vandalism, drugs. The burden falls very heavily on those whom we pay to keep the peace.
I'm not afraid too often. I get frightened. My major objective is to get home after 8.5 hours, regardless of what happens here, to get home.
25 Edward to Central.
And I think about it. I think about it regularly.
It's going to be at 303 East 118.
This is what gets monotonous, riding around at 10 miles an hour. It's almost like you're waiting for something to happen. Car stops are where cops get hurt. That's where cops get shot. I have a habit of taking my gun out of the holster and putting it in backwards because I can get it out faster. Some cops take their guns out. I see your license registration, right? You made a left turn back there. Off the corner. We'll let him go, Walt. Just gonna warn and admonish him, that's all.
Fired on the street at 123 Madison Avenue.
123 in Madison? Right up off of this corner.
4 yards, the story is so far. Repeating number 2, we got a violent issue going.
What do you got?
Portion, they got guns involved on the
Went through the park?
Portion again, okay. Calling at the Masseuse Forum. Still married, very good. That's 4. 32, David K.
Five RMP 1161 to Central.
1161, K.
Central, there seems to be an accident here. Shots fired at a gypsy cab. The perpetrator took off through the park. We'll have a description momentarily. 3 male blacks.
After a nighttime walk through Harlem, it's difficult to argue that the modern city is a noticeably safer place than the slums that Engels described more than a century ago.
Central, all we got is just 3 male blacks.
The resemblance is disconcerting.
It is only when the traveler has visited the slums of this great city that it dawns upon him that the inhabitants have had to sacrifice so much that is best in human nature in order to create those wonders of civilization with which their city teems. The more they are packed into a tiny space, the more repulsive and disgraceful becomes the brutal indifference with which they ignore their neighbors and concentrate upon their private affairs. Signs of social conflict are to be found everywhere. Everyone turns his house into a fortress to defend himself under the protection of the law from the deprivations of his neighbors. The observer of such an appalling state of affairs must shudder at the consequences of such feverish activity and can only marvel that so crazy a social and economic structure should survive at all.
Not all great problems are difficult. Sometimes they're merely made so by people who want to avoid the obvious but very painful solutions. Overwhelmingly, the problem of the polyglot metropolis is money. It takes a truly vast amount of money if people are to live safely and pleasantly in close quarters, and it takes far more money than anyone in the past has realized. Garbage is the symbol. Free enterprise is wonderful at providing what people discard and very poor at picking up the discard. Things work differently for the well-to-do and the poor. The affluent can pay to have garbage picked up, and for security services, and burglar alarms, and of course for housing and health care. Here, private enterprise works. Nowhere in the world Does private enterprise provide good cheap housing, good health services, good transportation, or police or schools or playgrounds? These the poor and the average citizen need. These the city, the public, must provide. This may not be the way things should be, but it's the way they are. The modern big city is, by nature, a social, maybe I should say a socialist enterprise. And all this is reflected in the cost. In the industrial city, public services required a relatively small deduction from private consumption. The day may come, I think it will come, when in the great metropolis, public consumption will be greater than private consumption, will cost more. This won't be the result of any ideological preference. It will be a simple matter of necessity. The singular feature of New York City is its private wealth and its public squalor. The remedy in principle is obvious. Higher taxes on the affluent, the people who can afford to pay them, more public services for all. The practical solution is more difficult. The affluent can now get much better services for the same or less money, escape the need for having to pay part of the costs for the poor by moving out to the camps. The obvious solution is to tax the whole metropolis for the common costs of the whole metropolis. And sooner or later, it's going to have to be done, because there isn't any other way. The acceptance of the social character of the metropolis involves more than questions of bread, butter, police, taxes. It also involves another dimension, that of art and design. That's a prime lesson of this history. The city was great when these were good. How do we escape from the aesthetic legacy of the Industrial Revolution? How do we recapture the order and the sense of household of Fata Sikri, the order and elegance of Bruges? There's nothing theoretical or precious about this problem. It's one that the practical administrator must face.
Any job like this requires decisions which are based on expediency rather than principle. And the difficult thing is to know when to put principle aside and do the pragmatic thing. I have more trouble with the politics of land use than I have with the economics of land use. What we haven't been able to do is to get political acquiescence in the public use of land because of the opposition of either the local householders or the local residents or the local storekeepers or the local what have you.
One rule can be laid down as firm. A unified overall conception for streets, offices, shops, housing, parks will almost always be better than when there is no governing order at all. There's no place where the substitution of social authority for classical laissez-faire is so urgent. To achieve this is a matter of political power and also of trust. We accept the judgment of scientists or physicians on matters of life and death. Good design is also important for our lives. And we must learn similarly to trust the artist.
The pressure of the multitude gets heavier and heavier. We've had the idea that the multitude being made up of very different and opposed pressure groups would somehow balance itself out and that the wisest course would emerge. But that doesn't necessarily happen. But of course, one person's principle is another person's obstinacy, so it's very hard to say what's the right thing to do in any circumstance.
we must also ensure that the design, the imposed order, will be accepted by the community. That means that housing, parks, subway cars must be a source of pride and not an object for vandalism and graffiti. Citizens must feel that the city is theirs. There are, we must believe, forces within the city that can be so used. Every inner city has a network of small villages, small neighborhoods, small households. Their community, and often their ethnic self-respect, is shown by the care that they take of their streets and their houses. This Puerto Rican street festival is called El Barrio with Pride. Perhaps it's important. One hopes so. Ultimately, it is the people and their identification with where they live who make a city work. Do we then solve all the problems of city life by returning authority to the people? It's a temptingly romantic notion, but I suggest that we respond with some caution.
Part of the urban crisis we've seen arises from the ability of the affluent to contract out, move to the surrounding camps. This makes the case for larger units, metropolitan or regional governments. Leaving tasks to the people can mean leaving them to the poor of the inner city who are the least able to pay. Also, it was rural poverty that sent people from the rural South and from Puerto Rico to New York. People of New York should not be asked to bear the costs of solving the age-old problem of land and people. That is a national responsibility. It is all the more so for the fiscal systems of most industrial countries, and this includes the United States, give the revenues to national governments, the people, and the costs to the big cities. The money goes one place, and the problems go another. But for tasks that are within the competence of the local community, there is an equally strong case for local authority and local responsibility. Planning is always an imposed order. It is more likely to be accepted if it reflects local preference, is imposed by people close to home. On schools, housing, hospitals, even law enforcement, the citizen needs to have a sense of personal responsibility and participation. And that requires the governing unit to be small. Votes must seem to count. And it is also good that politicians feel the hot breath of their neighbors on their necks. The constitution of the metropolis, in other words, must distinguish between what must be large and what can be small. This is a highly sensitive exercise in democratic design. To the nature of that design, and in particular its requirements in leaders and leadership, we come in the next program. But its test is where we have just been, the modern great metropolis.